Hello everybody and welcome to our latest webinar. Today we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about the job support scheme that was announced by the Chancellor at the end of last week. And I'm joined by Louise today, who is going to talk about the latest government guidance in terms of office workers who can work effectively from home should do so over the winter. We'll be exploring what that actually means when looking at working effectively. And we'll also be talking about health and safety requirements for those employees that do need to work from home. So the agenda is quite simple this morning. As I said, we've got the job support scheme and the section on back to home working. As you know, it's a live webinar, so but for the benefit of those that haven't joined us before, as it's live, please feel free to ask your questions as we go along, and Louise and I will answer them as we progress throughout the webinar. And of course, there will be some time at the end of the webinar to answer any remaining questions that we hadn't yet answered. So I hope you are all well and I hope you enjoy the webinar, and I will make a start by looking at the job support scheme. So as I mentioned, this was announced by the Chancellor on Thursday last week. It has been explained as a replacement to furlough, but because as we know, furlough comes to an end on the 31st of this month. However, as you will see, and as probably most of you who've looked at any of information that's out there on the job support scheme already, will see that it really isn't a like-for-like replacement of furlough. So what the Chancellor said is that the job support scheme is there and it's designed to protect viable jobs in businesses who are facing lower demand over the winter months due to COVID-19 to help keep their employees attached to the workforce. I'm going to take us through the eligibility requirements in a little while, but they don't, as of yet, in the absence of any detailed guidance at the moment, they don't, it seems, require an employer to actually show that the job is a viable job to be able to be put under the job support scheme. That isn't a criteria, but I will take you through the eligibility criteria in a second. So what I've done on this slide also is I've given you the link to basically the most comprehensive information we have on the job support scheme at the moment. And this is a fact sheet that was prepared by the HM Treasury. It's about 4 pages long. It's very useful. And it's basically a lot of the information that I've pulled together for this webinar I've taken from that fact sheet. But as we go along this morning, you'll see that there are areas that need clarification and we await the full guidance. So what do we know so far about the job support scheme? Well, we know that it's going to open on the 1st of November. So that is the day after the existing furlough scheme comes to an end. The scheme is set to run for 6 months, so that takes us through to 30th of April next year. And as I said, we have an HM Treasury fact sheet, which I've provided the link to on the earlier slide, but we are waiting for detailed guidance. We don't know when that detailed guidance is going to come out. I'm hopeful it will come out within the next week or two, to give us at least a couple of weeks before the scheme starts on the 1st of November. But we don't have a date from the government yet as to when they're going to release this detailed guidance. In a nutshell, the employee is going to be eligible under the scheme, the employee is going to have to do some work for the company. Then, in relation to the hours that the employee doesn't work, the government's going to pay 1/3 of hours not worked, up to a cap, which I'll come to later. And the employer is also going to have to pay 1/3 of hours not worked. And it's expected that the employee will then forego 1/3 of their pay in respect of their usual hours. But I'll come to that in a bit more detail in a second. But that is it in a nutshell. The government has confirmed that employers using the job support scheme will also be able to claim the job retention bonus. I talked about this a month or so ago when it was released. So this job retention bonus, that is for employees who were on furlough and who may still be on furlough, and those employees who come off of furlough and return to work and remain continuously employed until 31st of January next year. and the government has committed to say that they will make a one-off payment to the employer of £1,000 for every employee who was previously furloughed and who remains employed until the 31st of January. And you can still use the job support scheme for that employee, and they'll still be eligible for that bonus. So that's some good news. You may recall that the job retention bonus eligibility does have the criteria that the employee has to be paid at least £520 a month on average between the 1st of November and the 31st of January for the employer to be eligible for the bonus. It's unclear at the moment as to whether that £520 a month can include the payment for hours worked and the contribution to hours not worked, whether it can include the government grant aspect of it. I don't know. It could just be that the £520 needs to be in respect of the hours the employee actually works for you. That is unclear. And the other criteria for that job retention bonus, just a quick reminder, is that the employee mustn't be under a period of notice as at the 31st of January. With the job retention bonus, we were awaiting detailed guidance, and that was due out in September. And we're obviously on the 1st of October. So I did check this morning whether some further guidance on the job retention bonus had appeared, and it hasn't. So I wonder whether actually the guidance is being delayed slightly just so it does kind of cross-refer to the job support scheme. But I don't know. And obviously, when we know more information, we will share it with you. So let's look at eligibility. So first of all, I'm going to look at eligibility on the side of the employer. So the employer doesn't need to have previously used the coronavirus job retention scheme, i.e. you don't have to have previously furloughed any of your employees. You can access the job support scheme without previously using furlough, so that's good. We then have to look at the size of the employer. So if you're a small or a medium enterprise, if you fall within the SME category, then there is no financial assessment test for your business to be eligible for the job support scheme. We await confirmation, hope this will be in the guidance, as to the exact definition that will be applied for the size of a business which constitutes an SME. And it does change from kind of legislation to legislation, really, and certainly changes from scheme to scheme. However, we anticipate that it's likely to be a business with less than 250 employees. And there will certainly, we would have thought, be within the definition kind of a turnover threshold as well as to what is a small medium enterprise and then what tips you over to a large business. But at the moment, of course, we don't have that guidance, so I'm unable to be crystal clear, unfortunately, for you as to what that is. But I think, you know, if you have less than 250 employees, and hopefully we can be fairly confident, I would have thought that you would be an SME for the purposes of this job support scheme, but we'll need it to be confirmed. If you are a large business, then you will need to meet a financial assessment test. And this, at the moment in the fact sheet, is explained as having turnover lower than before, experiencing difficulties from COVID-19. So I'm guessing that is looking at turnover that is now lower than it was, say, February, March of this year. In addition, the government has said that it also expects such large businesses who are using the scheme to not make capital distributions, such as dividend payments, whilst accessing the grant. Okay. And as I've explained above, at the moment, it seems that the eligibility doesn't appear to include a requirement to show that jobs put under the table. They're just the employees that I've just gone through that's there at the moment. In terms of your employees, well, again, helpfully, your employees don't need to have been furloughed before if you want to put them on the job support scheme. So that gives you some more flexibility, which is good. The employee must be on the employer's PAYE payroll on or before the 23rd of September. So that was obviously the day before the new scheme was announced. And so all your kind of existing employees that you've got at the moment will be eligible for the job support scheme. For the first 3 months of the scheme, so from 1st of November to the 31st of January next year, the employee must work for at least 1/3 of their usual hours. Now, this is obviously a key difference to the furlough scheme that we had, because obviously the furlough scheme didn't require employees to perform any work, and indeed, actually, before flexible furlough came out, it was very clear that employees should not perform any work at all to be eligible for furlough. But under the job support scheme, the employee must work at least 1/3 of their usual hours. And I suspect that actually this is the government's mechanism for ensuring that employees on this scheme are actually in viable jobs, because of course it will need to be a viable job really to enable your employee to work 1/3 of their usual hours. After the first 3 months, the government said, so from the 1st of February, the government's going to look at whether they feel they should be increasing that threshold, that minimum hours threshold. So it may be that from the 1st of February, they, for example, could increase it so that employees must work for at least half of their usual hours. No doubt it will depend on how the economy is doing at the time, where we are in terms of COVID, any potential lockdowns. But obviously they've said upfront now that for the first 3 months, they need to work at least 1/3 of their usual hours, but this will be subject to review halfway through the scheme. The scheme is flexible. So what do I mean by that? So employers will have the flexibility to put employees on and off the scheme. And employees don't need to work the same pattern or working hours each month. Okay, so there is a lot of flexibility on the scheme. Employees can go on the scheme for a couple of weeks, come off the scheme, work their usual hours, and then go back on the scheme and work, say, half of their usual hours. Lots of flexibility there. The proviso is that apparently each short-time working arrangement must cover a minimum period of 7 days. Okay, so there is that minimum claim period of 7 days, which is kind of similar to the schemes that have been in place before. Employees can, of course, work more than 1/3 of their usual hours. The 1/3 is a minimum requirement, and there's no limit to the percentage of usual hours an employee can work. So they can work 50% of their usual hours, they can work 70%, they can work 80%, or even 90% of their usual hours, depending on, obviously, your business needs. Naturally, the more the employee works, the more that you'll be paying to the employee directly, and the less amount of government grants you'll be receiving. But just to make the point that it isn't a set 1/3, you can get your staff to work more than 1/3 of their hours. I've just seen a question pop up to ask, does the employee have to agree, or can a company just put them on the scheme? I'm going to address that very shortly. But Denise, if I haven't answered your question properly when I come to that slide, please do ask another question, okay? Thank you. So details of the actual government grant. Well, the employer will obviously need to pay for the employees for the hours that they work. Okay, so that's a relatively straightforward principle. For every hour the employee doesn't work, the cost is going to be split 3 ways. So the employer is going to pay 1/3 of the usual hourly wage in respect to the hours not worked. The government's going to pay 1/3, and then the employee is expected to forgo 1/3 of their usual hourly wage for hours not worked. What will happen is that you will have to pay the employee all the monies they are due. You will then have to submit your claim through, no doubt there'll be a new portal set up, and then the government will then reimburse you in respect of the grant that you are eligible for. Okay, so you pay the employee for the hours worked. The hours not worked, 1/3 is paid by you, 1/3 is initially paid for you, but then you get the grant back from the government, and then the employee takes like a 1/3 pay cut for those hours not worked. The government contribution is also going to be capped at just under £700 a month. I'm unclear whether that cap at present is in respect of employees who only work 1/3 of their hours, and perhaps the cap will be tapered down the more employees work. So perhaps it will be kind of reduced if they work 50%, 70%, etc. A bit like how the furlough scheme has been tapering down. I don't know at the moment. All I know at the moment is that they say that is the government saying that their contribution is going to be capped at just under £700 a month. The government's also not not going to cover employer national insurance contributions, and it's not going to cover pension contributions either. Okay. The guidance, when we receive it, is going to set out the method for calculating an employee's usual wages and for calculating usual hours, and that's particularly relevant, of course, for employees who may be on a variable working pattern. Employees who've been on furlough will have their pre-furlough pay and or pre-furlough hours applied to calculate the usual wages and usual hours. And from experience of flexible furlough, then this may well be a fairly complicated calculation that we need to apply. But of course, we will need to see the government guidance and see the examples that they will hopefully provide us with to see how complicated this is going to be. A final point on the government grant, but an important one, and this is that the government, in the fact sheet it has provided us with so far, says that its expectation is that employers cannot top up their employees' wages above the 2/3 contribution to hours not worked at their own expense. So you couldn't say, for example, have your employee work, I don't know, a third of their usual hours, and then in respect of the hours not worked, top it up so actually they don't receive any loss in pay. You can't do that, it seems. It's unclear whether employers are going to be able to top up above the government cap if it applies. So, for example, if the government, because the cap, if that grant doesn't quite cover a third of the hours not worked, we don't know whether the employer can top that bit up so that the employee doesn't lose out as much. We wait to see, and the guidance will hopefully be clear on this. But at the moment, I suppose the summary is that there is certainly the expectation that the employee will be foregoing a third of their wages for hours not worked. So some other key points, and this is a very important one. And I really kind of focused quite a bit on the actual wording of the fact sheet that's come out. And that says that employees cannot be made redundant or put on, my emphasis there, or put on notice of redundancy during the period within which their employer is claiming the grant for that employee. So again, this is another key difference to the furlough scheme. So we know under this job support scheme, employees can't serve their notice period for redundancy and be on the job support scheme. But it seems that actually looking at this wording, that it goes further than this, because it appears with the wording you can't put an employee on notice of redundancy, then in fact an employer wouldn't really be able to carry out a redundancy consultation exercise in relation to an employee while they're under a job support scheme, because of course when you do that at the end of that process, of course you're putting your employee on notice of redundancy. It will be interesting to see whether that is certainly the intention of the scheme, and hopefully the guidance will clarify that for us. But it is an important point to note when looking at workforce planning. HM Revenue and Customs has said that they will check the claims, and they have also said that employees will be informed by HMRC directly of full details of the claim. So that is quite different to the furlough scheme as well. This commitment to actually directly inform the employees of the claims received on their behalf. No doubt this is to deter employers from fraudulently accessing or using the scheme in a way that they shouldn't be. And this, to answer Denise's question, is that employers must agree the new short-time working arrangements with the employees, and we're going to need to enter into written agreements with the employees to change their employment contract. So yes, you are going to need agreement from your employees to go onto this job support scheme and to go onto short-time working. But in any event, even if the guidance hadn't have said that, I would be saying to you as a pure matter of employment law and contract that obviously this will be varying employees' contracts, and therefore we do need their agreement. But the scheme makes it clear that we need to record that agreement in writing. It says that they need to enter into written agreements. So we need that employee's consent recorded, and we need to retain those agreements because HMRC may ask to look at them later along down the line. Okay, it says that you need to keep the agreements available to HMRC on request. I've just seen a question actually, which does this apply to employees who are currently in a consultation process which started before this announcement? I'm guessing this is in relation to the redundancy point that I've just talked about. So employees that are currently on the consultation process, yes, I think obviously they may well still be on furlough. Nothing I've said here affects that. That's a completely different scheme. However, if you're in a redundancy consultation process, then as it currently stands, without seeing the detailed guidance, I would be reluctant to put the employees on the job support scheme immediately after the end of furlough if you're still consulting with them in relation to redundancy, because I don't think you'll then be able to put them on notice of redundancy if they're under that scheme. And certainly, if you issue your employees on the furlough scheme at the moment with notice of redundancy, you cannot expect them to serve their notices of redundancy and be under the job support scheme. They're going to have to serve their notice under their normal contractual terms and conditions. There won't be any scheme that will be available to help with that notice period after the 31st of October. Right, I think I'll probably deal with a couple of other questions that have come in at the end of my section, I think. Sorry, just checking I have, yes, I have. So job support scheme, potential issues. So this is just me putting my thinking cap on when I've looked at the job support scheme. The first question that I have is, does the scheme apply to workers? Because when you look at the fact sheet, you'll see that throughout the whole of the document, it only refers to employees. There is no reference to workers. Now, I don't know whether that is just because it was just a terminology that was chosen to be used, or whether in fact it means that the support scheme doesn't apply to workers. The guidance will no doubt confirm that point for us. The government has said that there will be calculations for those with variable working patterns. But again, does that mean it only applies to employees with variable working patterns? And so then it wouldn't apply to 0-hour workers? Not sure. We're going to have to see. But it is an important point because you may have a number of workers on furlough at the moment and you have to decide what you're going to be doing with them come the end of this month. Holiday accrual, our favourite topic. Obviously, we know with the furlough scheme, the government was quite late in clarifying the position with regards to annual leave as to whether it continued to accrue or not. And then we found out and had confirmation that actually holiday does continue to accrue for employees on furlough. Well, what about those employees in the job support scheme? Is holiday only going to accrue in respect of the actual hours they work? Or should holiday be accruing in respect of their usual hours, irrespective of how much they actually do work? Hopefully, when they issue the guidance, they will hit this issue head on and we'll have clarity straight away. No doubt, of course, if employees are only going to be working, say, a third of their usual hours, but the guidance says no, they should be accruing holiday in respect of all of their usual hours, then that's quite an additional cost to the employer when using the scheme. So we will see what the scheme says, but of course it's just something to factor in mind at the moment when you're looking at whether you're going to be using the scheme. National insurance contributions, how much? When I looked at other commentators' kind of take on the scheme, there seems to be a bit of confusion as to the national insurance contributions, how much the employer is going to be expected to pay. I.e., do they just need to pay it in respect of hours worked? Do they need to pay it in respect of all the money paid to the employee, including the government grant? Or do they in fact need to pay it for the whole 100% of what the employee would have received in respect of usual hours? I doubt it'll probably be that. I suspect it will just be all of the national insurance contributions that are due on the amount actually paid to the employee. But again, we will have to wait and see. The government cap. So obviously we know that there's that cap of just under £700 that applies to the government grant. But does it also apply to the employer 1/3 contribution of hours not worked? If it did apply, then we can see that actually for those high earners that you may have that you want to use the scheme, they'd be potentially being asked to take quite a significant pay cut. But I think in light of the current information that the employer can't top up to beyond the 2/3 of hours not worked, it suggests that the employer won't be subject to the £700 cap, because I would have thought if they were, then the government would actually be saying the expectation is that the employer doesn't top up at all. But again, we will have to wait and see. There's also the potential, as I've mentioned before, the potential complexity of calculating employees' usual hours. But we'll wait to see how straightforward they may make the scheme. One thing that I have focused on is that the eligibility criteria says the employee needs to work at least 1/3 of their usual hours. It doesn't go on to say that this needs to be in the employee's usual job. So that kind of begs the all-important question of actually, can we potentially redeploy some of our employees to a different role within the business, where there may be demand for some more work to be carried out, as long as they work at least 1/3 of their usual hours to hit the eligibility criteria. Because of course you may have employees who are kind of sitting on furlough that actually their job just isn't there, but you could potentially get them to do some work elsewhere in another department. I would suggest that, having looked at the information that we've received on the scheme so far, that actually, it just does say usual hours. And so hopefully we would be able to redeploy employees to a different role. But again, we are going to need clarity on that. But I think, if we can, then in terms of workforce planning, then I think we need to kind of first consider the workforce that are currently on furlough and whether there's enough work for these employees to work at least 1/3 of their usual hours to be put onto the job support scheme. And if not, and my understanding of the scheme eligibility, as I've just described, is right, then we can go on to consider, well, is there scope to redeploy these employees to other roles on a temporary basis to enable them to remain employed under the job support scheme, working 1/3 of their usual hours. So that's quite an interesting point, and I do hope the guidance gives us clarity on that. Of course, if you want to try to redeploy employees, then I will just make the brief point that, of course, you need to look at your contract. Do you have the contractual right there where you can require employees to carry out other duties? And even if you do have that contractual right, remember that it needs to be exercised reasonably. So therefore, you'll be looking at things like how different are the duties to what the employee normally would have carried out to what you're going to be asking them to carry out. And looking at the employee's skill set and experience. And of course, if you're going to be asking them to kind of work from a different location, then again, you have to be reasonable there too. But I think that's probably a topic for another webinar where we can go into that more detail once we actually know whether we can indeed redeploy these employees under the job support scheme, if that's useful for you. Consider how you're going to approach seeking employees' agreement to work on a short-term basis and accept this pay reduction. Obviously, for those that have been on furlough for a long time, they would have received a reduction in their pay for a long time if you've only been paying them, kind of the limit of the scheme. And so, i.e. the 80%. And so, some employees may be reluctant to now go on to another scheme that again requires them to kind of have a reduced pay. So consider how you're going to approach seeking employees' agreement to go onto the scheme. And the other thing is to think about is, this is all well and good, and you may say, right, okay, we've got 2 employees who do the same job. Okay, we could say both of them by putting, we don't have enough work for both of them, but we could save both of their roles by putting them both on this short time and working under the job support scheme. But remember, that's going to cost you more than having, say, 1 full-time employee. So 2 short-time employees working 50% under this scheme is going to cost you more than 1 full-time employee. And that's because, remember, you'll be paying 1/3 of the hours they don't actually work. And so the scheme does have its limitations. And finally, note that in your workforce planning and your business planning, two key points. One, the minimum hours threshold may change from the 1st of February, so that it's not just a third that they have to work, they may have to work more than a third of their usual hours. And secondly, the restriction on making employees redundant if they're on the scheme as well. So I'm going to come to the questions in a second, but for some businesses, the job support scheme no doubt is going to assist, particularly where businesses may still be operating at reduced levels and want to retain employees. And it's sometimes very important to retain employees if you've got that goodwill with them, if you need to retain their skills and experience, and if you know that actually you're expecting a good bounce back after after COVID and come early next year, and you want these employees sitting there with all their knowledge and the skills so you can get back up running as quickly as possible. So there is definitely a place for this scheme. But as I said, it's definitely not a like-for-like substitution to furlough, and there are some downsides for it. And I would suggest carefully kind of look at your requirements before launching into the scheme. Right. Some questions. I was just right. Sorry, I've answered the first two. So the second two, if the contract already has clauses about short-time working, does it need to be confirmed again? Well, yes, you will, because you need to enter into an agreement specifically for employees working under the job support scheme. And also, if the clause has a clause about short-time working, obviously you're still going to have to reach an agreement with the employees exactly how many hours they will be working. And of course, the pay reduction they'll be expected to take. So yes, we do need a clear agreement, an agreement that can be supplied to HMRC if required. Next question, if the employees do not agree, is the only alternative to put them at risk of redundancy? Well, if you don't have enough work for your employees, then yes, redundancy is certainly an option to be looking at, and certainly it would meet the definition of redundancy, i.e. less demand for employees to do work of a particular kind. There are other options. A few of our clients are actually looking at seeing whether they could kind of put in place a kind of company furlough scheme. So this is a kind of a furlough scheme that operates very similar to what the governments did, but of course the company is for funding all of this with no government grant. Other options may be to just suspend employees on a certain amount of pay, to take pay cuts, but all of that obviously is going to require the employee's agreement. And I think it's one of those situations really that unfortunately, with the end of the furlough scheme coming up, and if your business hasn't picked up, you don't have any work for the employees to do, then no doubt there are going to be quite a number of redundancies on the horizon. Right, next question. Do you do the pension contribution on the full salary or the reduced amount, including the government third? Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, and that's the same point, really similar to the national insurance contributions. I would have thought it would be pension contributions in respect of the amount actually paid to the employee rather than in respect of their full pay, but I don't know. And in respect of the government grant, well, the government said that they're not funding any pension contributions or national insurance contributions, but they haven't made it clear to the extent to which the employer is meant to be funding the national insurance contributions and pension contributions. Right, I'll ask this question, and then what I think we'll do is we'll pass over to Louise, so I don't eat up all of her time. And then what I will do, if there are more questions, I will certainly answer them at the end. It was agreed that pay for furloughed workers taking family-related leave was to be calculated based on usual earnings rather than furlough pay. Is it the same for the job support scheme? Sorry, let me just read that question just slightly in my head. It's agreed that pay... Yes, I would have thought it will be the same for the job support scheme, so that those employees taking family-related leave, you'll be looking at pre-furlough pay and or pre-job support scheme pay. So yes, I think it will be the same, but it will need to be confirmed. Right, Louise, should I pass over to you before I eat up all your time? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to cover something completely different, really. I'm going to cover the change in the government guidance as of last week with regards to office workers now basically working back from home. And then I'm going to just do a couple of reminders on employers' duties with regards to those employees working from home and those ones coming back to the office, if that's how your workers are working. And then I'm also going to touch on right at the end the regulations that came into force on the 28th of September with regards to self-isolation. So where are we now? Well, as of the 1st of August, employers did have more discretion to make the decision with regards to how best and safely their staff could work. And that could mean either continuing to work from home, or if the workplace was deemed to be COVID secure, then employers could start to make plans and bring people back to the workplace. Now, that kind of worked quite well in some respects. Some employers found that since working from home, their employees liked the work-life balance. Other employees found it really difficult to work from home, and productivity changed between the two. Some found it really productive to be at home, others just didn't at all. So it was kind of a welcome relief to some extent when the 1st of August hit and employers were given more discretion. They could speak to their employees and decide what was best for them. Unfortunately, last week we seem to have had the brakes put on the return to the workplace. From the 22nd of September, the government said office workers who can effectively work from home should do so over the winter. So it looks like we're kind of back to where we are. Although I'm going to cover effectively, the word effectively in particular here, because I think that's the key difference. So back in March, when we were sent initially into lockdown, the guidance was very much, if you can work from home, you must work from home. And that was kind of it. And as I said, it kind of was horses for courses. It worked well for some employers. It didn't work well for other ones. Often the employees found that being at home made them feel quite isolated, quite abandoned. And there's been a lot of mental health issues off the back of being in that situation for what has been the best part of 6 months. But now we're at the position where the government is saying, if you can effectively work from home, you should do so over the winter. So what does effectively mean? Well, I think using that word actually gives us a bit more scope, because I'm hoping that the government are a bit more aware that actually it's not as clear cut as just you need to be working from home and that's it. I think effectively in this case also covers the situation where you've got employees whose personal circumstances and who are working at home in quite challenging situations. Say, for example, they are in a house share where they can't get their own space to be able to work effectively, or they simply struggle being in those same four walls for extended periods of time. Then I think in this situation, employers have got a little bit more scope now to say, okay, and to liaise with those employees and say, okay, how are you going to best work effectively? If you cannot be productive at home because of your personal circumstances, then I think in those cases, those employers can then take steps to perhaps arrange for those people to still work in the office. So the general guidance and the general advice is that if office workers can effectively work from home, they should do so. But I think we've got a little bit more leeway now, is if you've got an employee who's saying, actually, I just can't do this. It's damaging my mental health. Then I think you can take steps to bring that person back into the office, again, provided that the workplace is COVID secure. And I'll touch on that later with regards to what employers need to do to make the office COVID secure, just as a recap, really. So on the basis, however, that the general advice is that we should all be working from home, what do employers need to do? And I'll just wait for my slide to load up, which seems to have crashed. They need to think about those employees working from home. They need to think about what their needs are. They need to think about how they're working, what activities they're doing and over what periods. And then off the back of that, they need to think of what practical steps they're going to put in place to enable people to work from home now on what will be a more long-term future at the moment. And they need to make sure that those workers who are working from home for perhaps the foreseeable future are doing it safely. And when you've had to think about all those questions, you need to put control measures in place to protect those employees. It's worth remembering employers have exactly the same health and safety responsibilities and duties to their employees who are working from home as they do for those that are actually in the workplace. So what are we talking about in terms of what employers should be doing? It used to be, well, it still is the case that if you have staff who are deemed to be permanently working from home, then as an employer, you are expected to undertake a risk assessment of their home workstation. Employees who are temporarily working from home, you don't have to take that step. Now, often when it came to actually undertaking that risk assessment, it could mean that as an employer, you actually have to go into that employee's home and undertake that risk assessment to make sure that they're working in a safe manner. We kind of seem to be in a period of flux at the moment because it looks like we're working from home for a longer period, but we're hoping that's still temporary. So I think the advice, however, still has to be that perhaps where we're looking at doing this for a number of months, that employers now think about actually undertaking a risk assessment of those employees' home workstation. Now, in the light of the current situation, you cannot be expected to go into your employees' homes and undertake that risk assessment. What I would suggest that you do is that you give your employees the tools to do it themselves. Now, some of you may know that when you're actually in the workplace, you may well have a risk assessment to look at an employee's workstation that would look at the setup of their workstation, the surrounding circumstances in terms of the display screen equipment, ventilation, the lighting, the electrical devices that are being used and the cabling to that, thinking about tripping hazards and all the rest of it. You may well have a risk assessment already in place for the workplace. I'd suggest that you can probably use that and give that to your employees to use as a checklist. So when they're thinking about their own workstation, they can have a think about what the hazards are, what the risks are, what they should be doing to make sure that the way that they're working is safe and that it's comfortable, on the basis that we may well be doing this for some time longer. So that's the advice with regards to what employers should be doing. There is guidance from the Health and Safety Executive, and there is also guidance from the NHS with regards to how to set up a workstation. And I can refer to any of those sources if that's of help when it comes to thinking about perhaps giving your employees the tools to undertake their own home workstation risk assessment. Off the back of that, it's important that employers provide those employees who are working from home with the appropriate equipment to enable them to work from home safely. So if they need an ergonomic chair, keyboard, a monitor to enable them to work more safely, then employers have duties to take steps as far as they can, as far as is reasonably practicable, to provide that to their employees so that they can work from home safely and comfortably. And finally, I think key is putting in place a system that allows you to keep in contact and to monitor and manage the mental health of employees working from home. I know a number of us have struggled working from home. I don't think that the benefit of being in the workplace, feeding off your colleagues and learning from your employees should be underestimated. And it's really difficult to work from home for such an extended period without that support and without your fellow employees around you and your colleagues helping you out. So it's so important, even more so now if we're going to be doing this for longer, to make sure that you've put in place steps to keep in contact with your employees, make sure that they know who they can speak to if they need to, and to monitor how they're getting on a regular basis. So they're the practical steps on the basis that it looks like we may well be working from home where we can effectively for the foreseeable future. So further on from this, it was just to touch upon and just really a reminder with regards to if it's the case that you are still looking to bring your staff back to the workplace because either they can't do their job effectively at home, whether that's because of their home working setup, or whether it just means that actually the nature of their job or the role that they undertake means that they just can't do their job effectively at home, you want to bring them back into the workplace. Again, the government guidance is very, very clear in that in order to do that, you will need to undertake a risk assessment to ensure that your workplace is COVID secure. And if you look at the guidance, it gives you a huge amount of information with regards to what hazards, what issues you need to think about, and then what steps you can take off the back of considering those issues, what steps you can take to make sure that your office is, or your workplace is COVID secure. It covers things like coming in and out of the office, staggering work times, looking at inbound and outbound goods, how you conduct meetings, and how you should think about a cleaning system, and to make sure that you've taken all steps that are reasonably practicable to make your office COVID secure. If you've attended these webinars in the past, you'll note that the key guidance is very much based upon each workplace and what you can do, what resources you have, what the layout of your workplace, what you can do will very much depend upon that. It's very, very industry and workplace specific. But if you are bringing staff back to the workplace, you need to undertake that risk assessment, share it with your employees, and then put in place appropriate practices and procedures to make sure that you're COVID secure. The other thing that I should flag up, and it may well be that you have undertaken that risk assessment, that you've taken into account that you may have employees who are either clinically extremely vulnerable or clinically vulnerable in response to the coronavirus. You should undertake for those employees who may well have been shielding up until the 1st of August, a specific and an individual risk assessment for those employees, and make sure that you liaise with them with regards to what you can do to make sure that when they're coming back to the office that they feel safe and secure, and that you've taken all reasonably practicable steps to reduce the risk of the transmission of the virus, and in particular to those employees, to the lowest level possible. So that's the other thing to flag up. Undertaking your risk assessment for the workplace as a whole, and then if you have any individuals or employees who are vulnerable, then make sure that you have a specific risk assessment for those as well. The key point is always with regards to liaising and cooperating with your employees to agree any practices and procedures that are put in place, because when it comes down to it, it's your employees that you want to feel safe and secure, and they know out of anyone how your office works, and they're the ones that can give you feedback as to what will work and what won't when they're undertaking their jobs. Finally, the updated guidance also covers the fact that they expect employers and workplaces now to take part in the NHS test and trace, which means that you will need to keep a record of all staff and contractors who attend your workplace for a period of 21 days. And finally, on that point, with regards to employers' duties, it's just a reminder to turn people away with coronavirus symptoms, which I'm sure probably goes without saying, high temperature, persistent cough, and loss of taste and smell, amongst others. So that's just kind of a reminder with regards to employers' duties if they're looking to bring people back into the workplace and what they should be thinking about and doing. Finally, I just wanted to highlight the health protection coronavirus restrictions, the self-isolation regulations that came into effect on the 28th of September, which some of you may or may not know about. And it's to some extent a little bit of a bigger deal. The reason being is that previously, the government issued guidance with regards to self-isolating, but what they've now done is they've made a specific regulation that means that these regulations are law, and it could be an offence if you don't comply with that law. I think we're going to probably do another webinar or another guidance in terms of this self-isolating regulations, and certainly a mail shot will be coming out in the next few days on this, because there's quite a bit more to it. But in a nutshell, employers must not now knowingly require someone who is to self-isolate to come into the workplace, and employees must notify their employer of their requirement to self-isolate, as well as providing the start and end dates for the period of isolation. And the important point to note, because this has now been put into legislation, there are fines if either the employer or the employee fails to comply with that guidance. They can be issued with fixed notice penalties. The first fixed notice penalty that can be given to either the employer or the employee is £1,000. The second one for failing to comply is £2,000. The third one is £4,000. And for the fourth fixed penalty notice, and for any subsequent ones, it's a £10,000 fine. So it is really important that you put in place steps to ensure that your employees and in particular line managers are aware of these regulations, and that they take steps to make sure that employees know to notify you if they do need to self-isolate, and that you don't encourage them or request that they come into the workplace when they're meant to be self-isolating. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover in a nutshell from the health and safety update in terms of the guidance, the U-turn to some extent, or certainly putting the brakes back on in terms of putting people back into the workplace. Just a reminder in terms of what you should be looking at when you're thinking about those people that are now working from home on a longer term basis. If you can, as I said, the advice would be undertake that risk assessment, provide appropriate equipment for those employees, and put in place steps to monitor the well-being of them. If you are looking to bring people back into the workplace because they cannot effectively work from home for whatever reasons those may be, liaise with those employees accordingly. Make sure your workplace is COVID secure and having undertaken that risk assessment. Think about those employees that are potentially vulnerable and what you can do to make coming back to the workplace safer for them. And then following the rest of the guidance in terms of the NHS test and trace and turning people away. So I hope that was helpful. With regards to any questions, I'm just having a look. Do we as an employer have a duty to notify why we aren't having office workers aren't working from home? I presume that you mean in terms of notifying we aren't having office workers aren't working from home. I presume that means notifying the HSE perhaps as to why they aren't working from home. And if that is what you mean, there's no duty that I know of. I suspect that what you would have to do is make sure that in terms of your practices and procedures, you've thought about why they can't work from home, why it's the case that their jobs simply aren't possible to be able to work from home. And the nature, I presume that would be to do with the nature of the role and what they're doing. And you'd have to just make sure you've had a thought about what you can do. As I said, the official guidance is that where you can effectively work from home, then do so. But if it's the case that you can't, I would simply suggest that you keep a note as to why that is the case and why perhaps individuals simply cannot do their job from home. If that isn't what that question meant, then please do email me and I'll chat through further what that query is. We have decided that employees will remain at home. What should we do if an employee insists on returning? I think you need to have a discussion with them as to why it's the case that they insist on returning. If it's the case that they are saying, actually, I just can't effectively work from home, then again, make a note of that. I don't think that that's an issue. If it's the case they just say, well, I just want to work from home and there's no real reason that you can get to the bottom of, then I think you probably need to explain to them what the situation is and whether we like it or not. Unfortunately, that is the government guidance. I'd just liaise with those employees. It is difficult to work from home. It has caused a lot of problems across the board for a number of us in terms of not having that separation between home and work life. Whether or not that's deemed sufficient, you need to speak to those employees, because you should be thinking also, however, and I think this is a good enough reason for those employees to come back into the workplace. If they are saying to you, look, working from home is damaging my mental health to the extent I can't do my job properly, then I think that's a good enough reason for them to be coming back into the office. You just have to be careful. You need to get to the bottom of what the actual issues are, and you need to be liaising with your employees and speaking to them quite frankly about it. If staff have to self-isolate but cannot work from home, we cannot pay them or they cannot take holiday, do they go on to statutory sick pay? Yes. My understanding from the guidance, and there'll be, as I said, there'll be a mail shot coming out later, that is exactly the situation. So if you have someone that needs to self-isolate, the first position is if they can do their job from home, then that is what they should do. If you can consider whether they can do any alternative roles, then to enable them to work from home, again, that's what they should do. If it's the case that they cannot do their job from home, then yes, my understanding is that they do fall down to go on to the statutory sick pay. So I hope that's of assistance, and I hope that that's answered any questions that you've got from my perspective. As I said, please drop me an email if there's anything else that I can help with. I don't think you had any other ones, Vanessa.
No, I don't think I did. But again, as Louise said, if anybody's got any questions in relation to the job support scheme, then please do drop me an email as well. Our contact details are on the next slide that I think you've received. I'm not going to click on it now because I don't really want to see my lovely pictures.
That's fine by me.
Yeah, or of course, they can also come. Any questions can come through via the email address you used to register to the webinar as well, because they are then forwarded to us as well. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning, and thank you for your questions, some really good questions there as per usual. And I hope that I've managed to provide you with enough of initial information in terms of the job support scheme to enable you to kind of at least carry out an evaluation as to whether you think it will be good for you or not, for your business or not. So no doubt we'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I think we'll we've already got the next topic lined up, haven't we? We're looking at SSP and things, won't we, and self-isolation. So, yes, so take care, everybody. Thank you very much, and I will see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.